This is Under the Lens, featuring economic research by Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. The content of this presentation is strictly the opinion of Gordon T. Long and is based on facts he feels to be accurate as a result of his research at this time. All listeners are advised to independently verify all research for market changes. The following opinions are not in any way a solicitation for business, nor should they be considered investment advice. You should always consult a registered investment advisor before making investment decisions. Now, let's join Gordon for today's show.
Good morning. It is Tuesday, March the 19th, 2013. I'm Gord Long at GordonTLong.com. As is normally the case, I have a lot of charts for us to go through this morning, so therefore I will pass over some of them quickly and leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You will need to open your viewer to full screen viewing or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's Global Macro Tipping Points research report document. The research document this month focuses on macro issues from a regional perspective. Therefore, the slides this morning will focus on global risk, the macro situation, and the United States. I want to tie them all together in a discussion of what I see to be a failure of global governance. It seems the world is mired in one crisis after the other. The truth is we are mired in one poor policy decision after another, whether monetary, fiscal, or public policy. We have a failure of leadership. Maybe we haven't seen strong leadership since the days of Winston Churchill and John F. Kennedy, to name a couple, but clearly today, and I think we'll see this as we go through these slides this morning, it's at the core of our problems. I want to start this morning's dialogue with a graphic I put together in early 2010. We were still in a state of shock at the time with the financial crisis. I was writing a series of articles then entitled Extend and Pretend. They're all up on my site in the commentary section. What was very clear and extremely worrying to me at the time was that we were not addressing the problems. We were avoiding the hard decisions. We were confusing major structural issues with short-term cyclical issues. This was in 2009-2010. We were married to Keynesian dogma that failed to understand the extent to which credit creation through the shadow banking system had distorted sound money, in my opinion, and I spelled it all out at that point in time. We failed to fully understand the issues associated with global trade imbalances and eroding U.S. dollar reserve position, out-of-control fiscal accountability and budgeting, and a complete breakdown in regulatory supervision, and the list goes on. The point was that I concluded that if this persisted, this roadmap shown here was likely to unfold. A financial crisis would turn into a regional, then global economic crisis, then into a political crisis. And I believe, in fact, that is exactly where we are now. I believe that, as shown on the left and right, we would proceed through that in very clear steps. I wrote in my 2011 thesis paper on Beggar Thy Neighbor currency wars, what today is now the hot topic. I laid out a lot of supporting roadmaps, but this one tied into my expectations with the stock market. It and others pointed out the criticality of the decisions that were being taken and how they would frame the eventual outcome of the roadmaps. I hoped for visionary and fearless leadership. I knew nothing less would succeed. I was continuously disappointed. This reinforced my conclusions. I have not been alone in both what I witnessed and what others also concluded. Studies and research by such organizations as the World Economic Forum concluded the same thing. The surveys of the best minds and most informed people in the world, which they have access to through their annual Davos conference, strongly said we have a global governance failure and it is getting worse. Not only is it getting worse, but the bad decisions are building on themselves in our highly interconnected and complex world and are quickly becoming possibly insurmountable, and potentially intractable. These issues were discussed 2 years ago and last year at the Davos conference. This year they weren't because the tenor was that the markets are up and Europe was considered to be solved and behind us. They felt that maybe they'd been lucky and stumbled through unscathed. Let's spend some time on the realities, though, versus the denial that a lot of people are now in. Global growth, despite unprecedented levels of stimulus policy, is failing. If measured with a proper deflator, I believe we would see it is actually negative. Anything below 3% on a global basis is considered a recessionary environment. Something is seriously not working. It's blatantly obvious. The chart on the left here from the OECD shows that globally we've entered contraction territory. Unemployment is steadily rising globally, and in Europe is a major problem. Youth unemployment globally is an extremely serious problem with levels that typically lead to rioting and social unrest. That's around the corner, in my opinion. The World Bank is now out with an exhaustive 600-page report spelling out that the world must create 600 million net new jobs over the next 15 years if we are to sustain our current economic levels. I simply don't see it happening with the current public policies in place. I'm not going to bore you with the charts on these subjects, but here is what Obama said to justify the biggest stimulus program in history a few years ago. The goal being to create jobs. Result? It didn't even achieve the levels he said we would have if we didn't implement the spending programs, shown here in gray. These are White House charts. These aren't my charts, marked up with the red from others. In actual fact, it's even worse than that, as shown in red. Additionally, I point out that it isn't getting better. The line is flat. This is nothing short of a disaster and shows, again, a failure of public policy. It isn't just fiscal spending policy that is failing, but also monetary policy. We now have negative yield across the whole duration of the yield curve. Monetary malpractice has resulted in mispricing, malinvestment, and dysfunctional markets. I've talked and written extensively on the degree of moral hazard and unintended consequences that has resulted from this. The only thing that appears to be positive, at least on the surface, is the stock market. With it going up, people interpret that as things are improving. They conclude this despite what they see and hear around them. If the market was down 6,000 Dow points, it would be closer to the real state of affairs as Wall Street has disconnected from Main Street. We all know that or suspect that, but it has. What is good for General Motors is no longer necessarily good for America. Large corporations are global corporations. They don't operate in America only. That's not a criticism. That's a fact, and public policy needs to understand that. John Reed, former CEO of Citigroup for over 15 years, and now chairman of MIT Corporation, the governing body of MIT Technology, said recently, the financial community has changed dramatically. The big banks are focused on creating investment products rather than on allocating capital to borrowers, so manufacturers have trouble getting attention and the U.S. production suffers as a result. This is the man that should know, and he's very clearly saying what it is, what's going on. Reed contributed to the new MIT report called Production in the Innovation Economy, which I did a tape with Charles Hugh Smith on specifically. Banks are not investing in American growth. They're just not. As a Chinese economic official said recently, in America, the brightest are not building products that people need, but rather trying to figure out how to pick the pockets of others. This chart not only shows that the marginal propensity associated with increased levels of liquidity injections is having less and less impact on the market, but far more important is that negative real interest rates and debt levels have stagnated the economy and are steadily eroding investment in America. CapEx, or capital expenditures, and top-line growth investment has plummeted. Wall Street investment is about non-operating expense investment, lower down on the P&L statement. That gig is running its course. We have flawed monetary policy and, frankly, politically driven monetary malpractice. So let's take a tour around the world and see if we can spot the global governance failures in real time. Cyprus is the hottest crisis du jour, so let's start there. Where was the regulatory enforcement that allowed this banking crisis to happen in the first place? The EU policy of kick the can down the road, unenforced EU monetary guidelines, easy peripheral credit, and a compliant ECB that accepted bogus collateral allowed the Cypriot banking system to become 7 times the size of the economy as hot Russian money flooded into the country. For the sake of time, let's avoid the whole discussion of why Russian government, oligarch, and criminal money was allowed to do this, both by obviously corrupt Russian government and a compliant EU. The short answer is that there was a lot of easy banking money to be made. So how is the inevitable crisis being addressed? What are the public policy initiatives to fix this? The first one was to steal, and I repeat, steal Cypriot depositor money at the expense of those who took the risk and who should be wiped out in the case of this word that everybody's forgot, bankruptcy. The people of Cyprus and the world are stunned and frankly frightened. That isn't flying. So we are now talking about nationalizing pension plans and turning them into government bonds. That is now stealing from pension holders. Another absurd public policy. How can people trust governments? They can't. And this is the public policy that's currently being debated as I take this here this morning. To make even this gambit happen, and I doubt it will fly, after creating a bad bank, they're offering the good bank to Russia's VTB bank, natural gas reserves to the oligarchs, and possible naval port facilities to the Russian government. The Troika has completely botched this, and it has successfully rattled the world because it shows the confiscation of private property and the complete disregard for property rights. Frightening. Frightening not just for Cyprus, not just for the EU, but globally, and people and money is paying attention. The EU is once again in a crisis mode, remembering it has never solved a single problem, and the problems in Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, etc. are just getting worse. We have a governance problem, clearly. So let's talk about Italy. There are 1,000 small businesses failing a day currently in Italy. The people who normally don't care about politics because it is so corrupt have become so frustrated and worried that in the recent election, they actually came out to vote. They dismissed the unelected technocrat banker Mario Monti because, as one of his opponents referred to him, as the banker's choice to supervise the bankruptcy and liquidation of Italy. And I thought that was very well put. Pepe Grillo, quite literally a comedian and clown, shown here represented in yellow for his votes from his cobbled together party, took a significant part that a ruling Italian government coalition can't now be formed. We have minimally 9 months of paralyzation in Italy during a critical time in the country's future in store. The reason is a complete distrust of EU governing, contempt for the political process, and a lack of confidence that anything being proposed is actually in the people's interest, but rather is in the bankers' and crony capitalists' interest. Remember, former Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi has been found guilty and sentenced to penitentiary time. The only thing keeping him from being incarcerated is him holding elected office. I mean, this is a real trust builder, isn't it? Whatever your views may be, you must agree we have a blatant governance failure here. We could march through Europe with the same results as country after country is rejecting their leaders in frustration and disgust. Europe has quite frankly not implemented any real austerity, but even the talk of it has removed one government after another. Before we leave Europe in our track around the globe, let's mention France. France, along with Germany, is considered to be the core that is holding the EU together. We have a country here that threw out President Nicolas Sarkozy and recently went with Francois Hollande's Socialist Party. They went socialist. Because of one blunder after another, including a tax on the rich that has forced high-profile French citizens to renounce their citizenship and leave the country, fights in the media with corporations leaving the country, such as Titan Tire, that call French labor laws unworkable, the party's popularity has plunged. This is the newly elected Socialist Party. Now Holland is in a fight with Germany, the other part of the core, since he is going to now defer French austerity programs for a year. Watch a year turn into 2, into 3, as the economic situation in France itself deteriorates. So here, even France won't abide by the EU Maastricht guidelines, won't walk the talk it has been giving the peripherals, and won't follow through on the platform it was elected on. We have a governance failure here. Getting the picture? So let's move to Japan. With total debt to GDP of over 500% and sovereign debt to GDP at over 200%, Japan is the worst in these measures in the world. With 20 years of stagnation, its competitive trade position is steadily weakening, trade deficits emerging for the first time, aging demographics straining traditional domestic funding, and the country faces serious problems. Once again, the solution has been to change the government, and therefore on December the 16th, Shinzo Abe was elected prime minister on a monetary policy of dramatically increasing money supply and the threat of taking over the Bank of Japan. We now have Abenomics, which has immediately escalated the global currency wars as the race to debase is in full flight as the yen plummets and everyone else needs to debase even faster. Abenomics calls for a quadrillion yen increase. I was just sort of getting used to trillions. I don't really understand what quadrillions are, but anyway. The IMF have officially warned previously that the current Japanese debt levels were unsustainable before this. That is IMF talk for unpayable, inextinguishable. We have a governance failure here. China has approximately 50 million people per year leaving the farms and heading to urban centers, expecting to find work to support families, finding it harder and harder to survive as prices steadily increase. Increasing, frankly, because of hot money and the developed countries printing at such a rate. Food prices, which is a dominant part of Chinese budgets, is rising more than 10% per year. With factories reducing labor content and labor moving to even cheaper countries, the government has a problem. In China, the government has one responsibility: to find work for its people, or there's massive social unrest. The governments can get away with almost anything, but they've got to deliver work. To ensure there is work, the credit and shadow banking system has been allowed to grow at such a rate that it now threatens a financial crisis. The ghost cities, mall, apartment buildings, commercial buildings, infrastructures empty are signs of the level of malinvestment that has occurred in this race to create work for its people. No one knows the true debt levels in China or the real GDP growth rate. The slowdown in Europe is already seriously impacting China. A slowing 70% consumption economy like the U.S. could be a tipping point in the next year. We have an unprecedented governance challenge even here. The U.S. economy suggests to me we are on the verge of a recession in the U.S. or very close to it. The latest sequestration and debt ceiling crisis is yet another example of the U.S. moving from one crisis to another. Confidence in Washington is at historic low levels. The sequestration crisis is an example of the absurdity of what is going on. Nothing was achieved. No monies were saved. Only the rate of increase was barely perceptibly adjusted downward, and then quickly spent on other things. Official debt, unfunded liabilities, and off-balance sheet debt is completely out of control with nothing being done about it, not even put on the table. We simply continue to print money and paper the problems over. As Jan Rifkin, co-author of an alarming new Harvard Business School report, Competitiveness at a Crossroads, said recently, as long as there's a wedge between our ambitions and our means, the crisis will keep coming back. I guarantee it. Once again, we have a governance failure. We have a leadership problem of bringing the problems to the table in a public policy debate with solutions and action plans. It's avoided at all costs. That is a failure of governance. Without leadership, every crisis is going to be solved in the easiest, most expedient manner, irrelevant of long-term consequences. Politicians just want to survive today. Tomorrow's problems are someone else's problems. Unlike other forms of occupation, there is no long-term accountability. Elections are fought on perceptions. Politics is a game of managed perceptions, not results. It is the blame game perfected. It is about power and the mother milk of power, money. Elections are obscenely expensive, and fundraising never stops and governing never begins. How can we expect the global governance to therefore act as these unresolved problems only get worse? Well, it's called OMF. Not long ago, you didn't know what quantitative easing nor ZERP was, probably. Well, get to know OMF, or overt monetary financing. This is a fancy and a very deceptive term for simply printing money and distributing it. Unfettered monetization of public debt. This chart shows in orange the dramatic increase in central bank balance sheets. What you see is that, like a drug addict, the usage becomes larger and more frequent. The blue line shows that every time the rate of increase approaches zero, the central banks take action. Each time it is being forced to be larger. This chart graphically depicts the realities of the treadwheel we are now on, and the reality that the next round needs to be an order of magnitude larger. Central bank balance sheets through OMF implementation are likely to double in the not too distant future. Politically, it is the easiest and therefore the most likely. This is the one predictable thing in politics. They always can be counted on to take the easiest way out. Normally, what stops this sort of irresponsible behavior in our modern fiat currency world is that the currency would collapse. But for a currency to collapse, it must collapse against something else. We presently have a global currency cartel, in that 90% of the world's trade is conducted in four currencies. If these four fiat currency regimes coordinate their actions or collude, you have a cartel. Like OPEC wanting to keep oil prices up and steady, the currency cartel all want their currencies to fall. They need to offload their debt by debasing it away. If they do it together, coordinated, they can get away with it, assuming there's no other currency flight option. Other options, such as gold and alternative currencies, are presently well managed in the interest of, let's say, national security, so that today there are really no real possibilities today. There soon will be. But for politicians, that is tomorrow's problem and someone else's worry. Print the money will be their call as soon as they learn to spell OMF. Obviously, others see the same thing, and central banks, other than the currency cartel, are now steadily accumulating gold. China is officially buying 1,000 tons a year, and I suspect unofficially much larger. Russia has been doing the same thing, as are the other BRICS countries and Chinese trading partners. Partially gold-backed alternative currencies are on the horizon, in my opinion. Not imminently. It will take a crisis, but that's what's coming. You must keep your eye on gold. You must keep it for a number of reasons. It is not only the fly in the ointment, but also gives you clues to what is ahead. This chart shows how gold is a near-perfect barometer of the size of accumulated global central bank balance sheets. Gold is real money. Printing money is a sham, and gold in this chart shows it beautifully. So what else does gold tell us? As you are aware, we do a lot of technical analysis at GordonTLong.com. So when we look at the current gold consolidation pattern, we see very predictable pattern which suggests an outcome. One of the most common consolidation patterns in technical analysis is the triangle pattern, which normally counts 5 ways in an ABCDE pattern. The chart is suggesting to us that after increasing volatility and market scares during Q2 2013, the next quarter, that in second half of 2013 we will see what we call the Great Reflation Part 3. Of course, this deflects attention from whom leadership and structural corrective changes is supposed to come from. Can anyone say global governance failure? I encourage you to review the macro-analytic tapes I did with Charles Hugh Smith on the global endgame and the discussions we had on this particular chart and cycles. The economy cannot recover until pricing power is restored to the global economy. Mispricing, malinvestment must be corrected. This normally takes the form of a market clearing event, but is more than just the financial markets. It's across all assets. Global governance is mistakenly not allowing capitalism to work by trying to avoid at any cost the natural and required process of cleansing needed for capitalism to work properly. Bankruptcy, for example, is a necessary ingredient. Avoiding it at all costs is destructive, but politicians are not visionaries. Pain of any form costs votes and campaign money. It must be avoided at all costs. It is why we have a global governance failure. As the currency cartels race to debase your assets and your net worth, understand who is responsible. Understand what they can be counted on to do. And most importantly, prepare yourself and take action before you are standing like the Cypriots with closed ATMs and your pension held in freshly printed, worthless U.S. government bonds. Together now, let's all say it. We have a global governance failure. In closing, I'd like to take a moment as a reminder. Do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis, not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches, and making decisions. Do your reading. Make sure you have knowledge and a well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2013 be an outstanding investment year. I can assure you one thing, it's going to be an interesting year. Talk to you later.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.